Good evening. I am Jim Pfeiffer. I'm the Executive Director of the Regional Water Authority, and I want to welcome all of you here tonight to this Stakeholder Forum. This is the beginning of a conversation with the community about the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. We will have a number of stakeholder meetings in the future. This is the first one, and I'm really excited to have this one, and I'm excited that all of you are joining us. We're going to have a few members introduced in just a moment of the RWA and Stantec team. Again, thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Vanessa Nishikawa.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Vanessa Nishikawa with Stantec, and I'm part of the Water Bank Development team. And again, just want to welcome you all here this evening to join us for our first Stakeholder Forum. With me today are Jim Pfeiffer with RWA, Trevor Joseph, RWA's Manager of Technical Services, Ryan Ojakian, RWA's Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Manager, and along with me are also a few members of the Stantec team who will be probably responding to you this evening, and you'll probably likely hear from all of these folks. So the members of the Stantec team here today are Ibrahim Kadam, Christy Clark, and Atlee Keller. Again, we're very excited to start this process with you and to share information with you. And we're looking forward to the input and dialogue that we hope is just beginning with all of you. This is the first of several forums, as Jim said, and these forums are certainly not your only opportunity to interact with us on the water bank. And many of you responded to our question in the registration form about what would you like to learn about the water bank? Thank you for doing that. Those answers helped us develop content for this forum, and also get a better sense of your interests and your concerns. And know that we are early on in the water bank development process, so we don't have all the answers yet, but that's one of the reasons why we reached out to you and why we're so glad that all of you are here. Your input is very important to us. And we acknowledge this is a complex topic and there's a lot to digest today. So we will be making the slides available after the forum, so don't worry about taking them down as we go through our presentation today. Before I turn it over to Trevor, I'd like to quickly cover some ground rules for tonight's forum. Participation. If you have a question or a comment, use the Q&A panel. It's being monitored by the team. Times for questions and discussion have been built in today's agenda. This is a remote meeting. If you're having any technical difficulties, email Atlee Keller at atlee.keller@stantec.com. And follow up. There'll be a survey that will be sent to you at the end of today's event. And after that, if you think of something, please email us at waterbankinfo@rwah2o.org. And this will also, all this information will be in the slides, so you'll be able to see them later and be able to have those email addresses as you need to move forward. And I think Atlee will be putting her email in the chat in case someone needs to contact her on that. We are capturing what comes in through the Q&A panel throughout the entire presentation. So your input is not necessarily being lost if you don't hear someone answer your question immediately. We do have Q&A times and discussion built into the agenda today, as Trevor will talk about. And if we don't get through all the Q&A, know that we still have that, and it will help inform us as we move forward, and we will do our best to get answers to you as we move along. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Trevor to walk through the major agenda topics.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. Again, my name is Trevor Joseph. I'm with the Regional Water Authority. Tonight, what we would like to present to you is a series of agenda items here. One, we're going to describe who is the Regional Water Authority, what we do, and our relation to this project, the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. Also describe the stages of development of the bank as we see it today, and generally giving kind of a roadmap for where we are now and where we hope to be in a short amount of time to complete this project. Then we have two major agenda items, climate change impacts. I'll be turning that over to a colleague here to cover California's impacts related to climate change, what we're seeing in the American River Basin, and then some adaptation, I should say, measures that have been identified in some recent documentation. We will have a set of questions and a discussion after that agenda item. So I please ask that you obviously hold questions and we will discuss them at that time. Obviously, you'll be submitting them through the Zoom form, but we will open it up at that time and try to work through all your questions on this item. Then the next item is the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. A lot to get through on this item, giving an overview of groundwater and the potential for water storage in our region. We'll touch on what is conjunctive use, essentially the fundamentals of that water management tool and the success that we've seen to date. We'll talk about water banking, the approach that we're planning to take and what we think are the benefits to this region. And then again, I'll come back to the stages of the Sacramento Regional Water Bank flow chart or roadmap so we can kind of talk about next steps. And then again, we'll have a block of time set aside for questions and discussion. And again, really looking forward to engaging you during that time. Finally, we'll just highlight the ways to stay involved in this project. So with that, let's start with the first agenda item, the Regional Water Authority. And I'm going to read this just so I don't get it wrong. So our mission at the Regional Water Authority is to serve, represent, and align the interests of regional water providers and stakeholders for the purposes of improving water supply reliability, availability, quality, and affordability. And the map on your right is the Greater Sacramento region. And currently there are 21 member agencies of the Regional Water Authority, counties, water agencies, cities, districts that we have the honor of representing. Our role on this project, the Sacramento Regional Water Bank, is we're here to administer this effort on the behalf of 10 of these member agencies and ultimately ensure that it is developed in accordance with requirements and guidelines on developing a water bank. So a lot to convey here on the stages of the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. Bear with me. Couple of concepts that we want to make sure we describe clearly tonight. One is that we are here. It's the end of 2022, and we've had a lot of success working on essentially practices that serve as the foundation of our future water bank. And I'll explain what that means more. Essentially, again, it comes down to conjunctive use. And again, I'll define that term. But we've experienced and worked through all of our member agencies a series of milestones, whether it's infrastructure, wells, conveyance, interties, ways to recharge through wells, aquifer storage and recovery, or transmission pipelines to bring in surface water supply, or a lot of planning and programs. And this is not a comprehensive list, but activities and plans and programs that we've developed to advance conjunctive use in the region. And again, this has been happening now for approximately 30 years. Where we're at now is really working to develop a water bank. Again, as I mentioned, the practice or the foundation has already been set with a lot of activities that we've worked on conjunctive use wise, and we're looking to actually enhance those to address financial institutional barriers and really create a mechanism to advance conjunctive use in increasing the amount of water supply we can make available in this region. So the stages, the way we're breaking down this project is in 3 stages, as you can see. Conceptualizing. So we're really here at the beginning. That's one of the benefits of having this stakeholder forum with you is we're really interested in your thoughts on the bank. We really want to have a meaningful dialogue, not just here, but also on an individual agency or basis with whoever you represent or the general public. So we're really interested in your input even after this forum. The next stage is, and I'll describe as we close out this series of slides on the water bank, the specific planning activities kind of in that gray box, because it'll give you more information in terms of the specifics during each stage. But the next stage is going to be really defining and evaluating based on a lot of stakeholder input, and then ultimately formalizing all of this input into working towards what's described really as a federally recognized water bank. And again, I'll define that term throughout this presentation. So again, a lot to kind of get your head around, but we're really at this first stage, conceptualizing and ready to begin. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ryan Ojakian, who's going to cover climate change impacts.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. Appreciate that. Really what I want to cover here is what are the changes that we're seeing as a result of climate change, and what does that mean for water supply? There will be some discussion about what that means statewide, but really we're driving at what are the impacts here locally in the Sacramento region. Next slide, please. So we have to start at the beginning, and you guys are going to hear me say this several times through this portion of the presentation, but I want to say up front, what are the things that you need to take home from my portion of tonight's agenda, which is, I think, really well summarized here in this slide, and just a little bit of framing on this slide. This image that's up on your screen is from the Legislative Analyst's Office. They did a report this last spring about what are the impacts that climate change is going to have in California, taking a statewide approach. So the legislative analyst is nonpartisan. The name sort of says it, all branch of the legislature. But here are the big things that you need to be mindful of. That temperatures are going to go up. That's going to result in changing hydrologic patterns, primarily that you're going to see more rain and less snow, and a greater deal of variability or volatility or extremes, right? So big storms, longer periods without precipitation. The hazards that you see there, really what we're focused on today is responding to drought, but there's a relationship with all of the other impacts there. And then next slide, please. So a little bit more about what can we expect to see, and these next few slides, we're going to run through a little bit of what we have seen. This is both statewide and here locally through these next several slides. So what you have here is information from the Public Policy Institute of California. And if you look at that figure, the map of California on the left, that's from an extremely wet year. In fact, the wettest year on record in the state of California, 2017. And that large arrow represents the amount of precipitation that came through the Sacramento, San Joaquin watershed. It includes us, but it's more than just our region. What I really want you to notice in that figure is the size of the arrows on the left-hand version of the map of California. Then on the right-hand version of California, again, the size of the arrows, but just how small they are. That's from water year 2021. Not the driest on record, but pretty close, third driest on record. And then really what I want you to take home here is in the bar graph portion of this slide, you can see there's an orange portion. And in 2017, so what is that orange portion? That's uncaptured outflow. And you can see in 2017, there's a very large orange bar. And in 2021, there's a essentially non-existent orange bar. And so that really, in my opinion, captures the challenge that we're seeing in California hydrology. It's that it's coming all at once or not at all. So next slide, please. But what are some of the actual observed changes that we've seen here in our watershed, in the American River watershed? So this is data from Blue Canyon, and this is temperatures, annual temperature dating back to the middle of last century. So Blue Canyon, if you're not familiar, is if you drive out Highway 80 towards Tahoe, it's a little bit before you get to the ski resort Boreal. If that doesn't resonate with you, upper watershed. So temperatures in the upper watershed have increased by 3 degrees since the middle of last century. Again, this is observed data. So what does that mean? It means that we're experiencing longer, hotter periods. And then I think the key thing here is that it's resulting in earlier runoff, earlier release of our water supplies. And we'll get into why that's so important in just a few slides. So next slide, please. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that with increased temperatures, we have decreased snow days. So again, this is data from the middle of last century. We've seen a decrease in snow days by over a third. So from about 110 snow days down to about 70 snow days. And so commensurate with that, what we're seeing is precipitation coming more as rain and less as snow. Probably the second time I've mentioned that. I'm going to say it at least one more time, if not two more times through my portion of the agenda here. Because the earlier icon that we had up there, earlier runoff and more rain and less snow, is really why we have reduced water availability. And we'll get into that because it may be a little bit confusing, because total amount of precipitation may or may not change that significantly, but the changes that from earlier runoff and less snow, more rain are going to, those changes alone are going to result in less water availability. Next slide, please. So again, I mentioned up at the top, because we just ran through warmer temperatures, more rain, less snow, but volatility extremes. So yesterday was actually the 1-year anniversary of the single wettest day on record in the American River watershed. Some of you probably remember it. It was an extremely rainy Sunday. In fact, it was over 5 inches of rain in the Sacramento area, and then over 10 inches of rain again in the upper watershed at Blue Canyon. The other thing, so really quick, just level setting, water year is not calendar year or fiscal year. If you're like a policy wonk, it's its own year. It runs from October through September. So last year, so we've recently started a new water year, but last water year, really on a statewide level, the exception to the rule was that you weren't an extreme in one way or another on a monthly basis. So what do I mean by that? Last October was the wettest October on record. Last December was the wettest December on record. Last May and September were also the wettest on record. On the flip side, last November, January, February, and March were all the driest on record. And frankly, that's what we can expect more of moving forward, which is if you're just going to have one extreme or another, and you're going to be flipping between those two. So next slide, please. So, you know, we're cognizant of all of those observed changes as a region, and we engaged in an analysis in partnership with the Bureau of Reclamation to look at what can we expect moving forward? What further changes will climate change produce? And as part of that, we looked at what are the key vulnerabilities in the region. And I'm only going to focus on a few of these here. It's really the shrinking snowpack, which you've heard me say before, Folsom small size, but then another thing that I haven't mentioned yet, that Folsom has competing priorities. And I'm actually going to get into what I mean by competing priorities in the next slide. Next slide, please. So climate change is creating a catch-22 for our water supplies. And this relates to Folsom, and I'll explain it like this first. Folsom has to meet a couple of priorities and they may seem to be in competition, and frankly, climate change will make them be in greater competition. Folsom needs to meet flood protection purposes and water supply reliability. It used to be, and the reason why the system worked well last century, it would be if you got a big winter storm, you could focus Folsom operations solely on flood protection, because that big winter storm was going to leave a bunch of snow on the mountain that would come down in the spring and summer. That's what's going away with climate change. What's happening is your flood conditions and your water supply are coming at the same time, all in the handful of winter months. And so, you know, that's related to the temperature change that you have there on your figure on the right. Moving forward toward the end of the century, temperatures are going to continue to increase. We're projecting somewhere in the range of 4 to 7 degrees end of century, but it's going to get particularly warmer in the upper watershed where you would normally be getting that snow. So next slide, please. So the other thing that we did in the American River Basin study was we looked at ways at how we adapt to these changes. And frankly, I don't know if I said adapt earlier, but I'm glad that I'm ending with that. This is my last slide before we get into questions. One thing that I meant to say, frankly, in one of the earlier slides is climate impacts. A lot of people think about mitigation as opposed to adaptation, and we are strictly talking about adaptation here tonight. So what's the difference between mitigation and adaptation for those of you through those terms maybe you may be unfamiliar with? Mitigation is really how do we reduce the emissions that are causing climate change, and adaptation is how do we deal with the emissions that have already occurred. And so just one point on that, even if emissions went to zero next year or tomorrow, I should say, we're going to be experiencing changes that we're going to need to adapt to for the next several decades. And those were the changes that I ran through. But as part of the ARBS, we looked at half a dozen different adaptation strategies. But let me just say that it was a very high level look in the ARBS, that it was not a here's a scoping for a project level look. It was, here are approaches that we should explore further. And that's what we're doing here tonight with the water bank. And so that's where I want to finish and just underscore that the ARBS was not sort of definitive about what we're talking about with the water bank. And in fact, tonight is really important to kicking off that process about what does the water bank look like. So thanks, and next slide, please. Happy to take questions at this point.
Okay, so we've already had some questions and comments posted in the chat, in the Q&A panel, and we'd like to start going through some of those questions, and some of them have been answered, and you're able to see them in your panel under answered. But there's a few that we would like to just start reading out to the group today, and then the team will answer them. So the first one is from Muriel Strand, and it's, how does rainfall infiltration improve with less pavement and more organic matter in the soil?
Trevor, you want to take that one?
Yeah, very good. So the question, of course, is how does rainfall infiltration improve with less pavement and more organic matter in the soil? That's a really good question. I don't know the specifics of how infiltration works with organic matter versus essentially soil where there's a lack of organic matter. That has been studied in recharge basins, actually in Los Angeles basin, as generally they try to keep organic matter out of managed recharge basins. But as it relates to just general soil conditions, I'm not sure, to be honest, if there is a benefit to having organic matter in the soil. Certainly pavement prohibits recharge from rainfall. And it's, one of the focuses on many urban settings is to try to identify areas that are good recharge, natural recharge locations, and to try to protect those so that the groundwater basin can be recharged with rainfall. Interesting question, and again, I'm not sure on that second portion of that question.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. And as we've stated before, we are fairly early in the development process now, so we will probably have more detailed answers as we go along. There was another question posted in the Q&A panel about what conjunctive use means, but we want to hold on that one because that's actually covered in the next section. So you've read our mind and you know where we're going with that. There was a question about, I would like to know who is attending this webinar since we cannot see the attendees. Maybe people can introduce themselves here. Unfortunately, we don't have time in the agenda probably to go through individual introductions, but I believe there will be information somewhere later on with who has attended this webinar. And the webinar is being recorded, so it will be posted somewhere on RWA's website, and folks will be able to see information there as well. There was a question from Ted Rao on the RWA goal or mission does not mention the environment. Are environmental concerns considered a stakeholder? Jim, you had answered that in the chat, but would you like to read off your answer?
Yes, I believe that those are stakeholders.
Okay. There's another question from Yurli Pishtoy about getting the slides and would they be available after the webinar? And yes, we will be sending them out afterwards. There's a question from Gwen Pratt about you are familiar with the term transvaporation. I've been told that due to climate change, transvaporation has decreased, which has decreased watershed runoff. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, I believe referring to obviously ET, evapotranspiration, and how plants and essentially evaporation is affected by climate change. And yes, that does decrease runoff in the watershed. In fact, the year before last, soils were so dry that a lot of the rain events early on in the year really didn't show up as much runoff as many were predicting, in large part, the scientists believe, due to the soil conditions being drier than they have been in many years. So no, I think you're accurate, and I think that's an accurate statement.
There's a question from Suzanne Pesci about in water banking planning, are domestic wells considered stakeholders or interested parties? Or is that part of what is decided in the planning, whether they are participants or protected parties?
Yeah, in the water banking planning process, as well as other planning that this region has completed, and I'm thinking of recent sustainable groundwater management planning, that domestic wells are definitely part of the stakeholder engagement process, reaching out to domestic users and really understanding where they're at, and essentially the depths of those wells is very important to designing and or operating groundwater management, so that their interests are evaluated and considered in any management decision. So yeah, domestic wells are very much also right now. You may have seen a lot of news statewide looking at potential domestic well challenges in other basins. We're somewhat fortunate that we have a fairly sustainable groundwater supply and levels, so we haven't really seen impacts in our basin, and we're working to maintain that condition. And again, I'll touch on groundwater levels and some science related to groundwater in the next segment.
Okay. There's a follow-on to that. Or is there a possibility that domestic wells in the SASB, so the South American Subbasin, be treated differently depending on well location relative to watersheds and potential habitat restoration and species protection with respect to water quantity and quality?
Yeah, I have to kind of read that question. Sorry, bear with me. I'll take my glasses off again. So there a lot to that question. And actually, I apologize, I don't see it. Let's circle back to that if we don't answer some technical details related to just how groundwater is managed in the basin after the next segment, please.
Sounds good. There's a question from Chris Little. Portions of our region have septic systems. How do we protect the aquifer bank from being negatively affected by the septic systems?
Yeah, great question. You know, septic systems are very shallow, don't really extend to the depths of our main aquifer that provides the majority of water for our region. Certainly domestic wells can be affected by septic systems because they're generally much, much shallower. We're fortunate that the way the aquifer system works is frankly, it's a filter. So often these constituents related to domestic or septic systems really are filtered out way before they reach the groundwater that we draw from in our region.
Thank you. There's a question from George Murphy. Are there now test recharge wells in the SASB similar to what is being done in the Cosumnes Subbasin? Where are they located and how many?
Yeah, we do have a lot of test wells. We call them monitoring wells. We have a very comprehensive monitoring well network throughout both basins, the North American Subbasin and the South American Subbasin. And again, we'll define those terms in the next segment. We have actually documented the location of those wells in recent state required sustainability plans, and we can always point you to that information online.
Robert Burness asks, shouldn't there be a collective dialogue among stakeholders and RWA regarding the design and implementation of the water bank rather than Q&A?
I'll take that one. So we do want to engage in a dialogue with stakeholders. What I want to say is the RWA has an open door policy. Please get a hold of us if you have any concerns or want to talk about this more. We want to structure this meeting tonight in a way that we can address questions and efficiently get through the information, but also have the opportunity for you to ask questions and us answer those questions for you. Thank you, Mr. Burness.
There's a question from Ted Rao. Since part of the Cosumnes Basin supports the American River Basin, why is the Cosumnes Subbasin not included in the water bank?
I'll take that one too. So the water bank mostly focuses on the urban area, mostly with urban water providers right now. Those are outside the Cosumnes Basin. Perhaps in the future, if there are opportunities to bring the Cosumnes Subbasin in and they are interested in participating in the water bank, that could happen. But for the time being, that is not contemplated.
Great. Christy, are there any other questions posted in the chat?
I do not see any others that have not already been answered. Let's see if there's one that just came in. There is one.
George Murphy had a follow-up. I was referring to groundwater recharge wells versus monitoring wells.
Thanks for the clarification. So recharge wells, yes, there are recharge wells in the basin. There's only a few of them. It's a kind of a more advanced infrastructure. City of Roseville has recharge wells. Really, the science and the technology is called aquifer storage and recovery. There are other agencies in the greater Sacramento region that are also looking at aquifer storage and recovery using recharge wells. Currently, the City of Roseville has 6 wells and is looking to expand. There are also wells just outside of our region in the Woodland area. Woodland also has an aquifer storage and recovery system.
Any other questions in the Q&A panel?
And we can always obviously come back,
Yes.
and you're not limited to climate change questions at the end. So we'll work on cleaning up any questions pertaining to that second agenda item after the third agenda item.
Ocean Reserve also has asked a question about the North American Basin and recharge wells. We can answer that question too.
Okay.
Trevor, do you want to take that one or me? OSHA is asking, you mean North American Subbasin, right? There are no recharge wells in the South American Subbasin. So I think that's just a confirmation.
Yes, I'm not aware of any aquifer storage and recovery recharge wells in the South American Basin. at this time.
And there was another question from Suzanne Fishy. Are the recharge wells using recycled water or groundwater?
Yeah, the recharge wells are actually using treated surface water, essentially drinking water from Folsom Reservoir.
Great. I think that's it as far as what's in the Q&A panel right now, but please continue to add in your questions, your comments, and we will address them as we go along.
Very good. Let's keep going. We'll move to the next agenda item, the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. So there's multiple elements of this section of this agenda item that kind of build on one on another. And so I will kind of start at the very top with groundwater and recharge methods, just making sure we clearly kind of define this term. Thank you. So here's obviously a three-dimensional depiction of a surface water and groundwater system. You can see here, obviously, wells, percolation ponds, treatment plants. It's called conjunctive use pipelines. You can see the groundwater beneath the surface. It's a misconception that groundwater is in big open caves. Groundwater exists between grains of sand, gravel, and clay beneath our feet, kind of as if you were to dig close to the ocean in the sand through dry sand, and then all of a sudden you hit water. That's essentially what groundwater looks like, as it occupies that space between the grains. There is no meaningful amounts of groundwater in bedrock. There is groundwater in fractures between bedrock, but there is no meaningful amount of groundwater as you get into the foothills. I always joke, Rockland and Granite Bay are called that for a reason. There is no meaningful groundwater as you move east outside of the greater Sacramento area. So there are different recharge methods. There is natural recharge. This occurs through streams and creeks that naturally percolate into our groundwater basin. What's called mountain front recharge. A lot of recharge occurs, although not well depicted on this graphic, really at that interface between the foothills, the bedrock, and our groundwater basin. And then there's rain, there's direct percolation that occurs that's been discussed in some of the Q&A. There is artificial recharge. That's also been discussed, obviously, in the Q&A, the recharge well question. There is direct injection of treated drinking water. Cities like Roseville and others outside of the region recharge water artificially. And again, they're recharging treated drinking water from Folsom Reservoir. So they're recharging surface water. Percolation ponds are also another effective way, but the soil conditions have to be good, meaning they have to be somewhat permeable for water to recharge artificially using percolation ponds. If you've been down into the Kern and areas near Bakersfield, you may have seen some massive percolation pond recharge water banks actually in that vicinity of the state. Then finally, there's in-lieu recharge, and we're going to focus a lot on in-lieu recharge. It's mainly the direct or the most applicable type of artificial recharge that we've enabled in our region, and that's storing water by utilizing surface water in lieu of groundwater pumping. So essentially, we're getting a recharge benefit by not pumping groundwater during certain year types and utilizing surface water. Next slide. And this is not the best aerial imagery. I apologize, and a little hard to see maybe at this scale, but we needed to kind of pull back to really illustrate the three reservoirs, the way we look at water in our region. And the reservoirs are what you're familiar with, obviously, is a surface water reservoir, Folsom Reservoir. That surface water reservoir sign is pointing to Folsom. It looks, incredibly small at this scale, and it is a relatively small reservoir for the size of our watershed. So we are only able to store so much surface water or collect so much surface water as it moves from our snowpack through our rivers, creeks, and streams out ultimately to the Golden Gate, through the Delta to the Golden Gate. The other reservoir that we consider is our snowpack. Very important reservoir that traditionally has released water somewhat slowly. And that benefits us, again, because our surface water reservoir is relatively small in our region. And Folsom's not the only surface water reservoir that we have access to, but it's the largest in our region. As Ryan pointed out, that climate change projections illustrate that actually snowpack is going to decrease, making it more challenging to store that water. And essentially we lose volume of water as that water is reduced, that snowpack's reduced in the volume, but also the way it is released in terms of earlier release. And then finally, the groundwater basin is our other reservoir system. In our region, now the groundwater basin here is illustrated throughout the entire Central Valley. In reality, it's a massive groundwater basin that has been carved up into what's called subbasins. And in our subbasin, and I'll highlight this on another slide, we have a lot of storage capacity and frankly, a lot of groundwater in our groundwater subbasin. So we're really, with the water bank, looking to optimize and through conjunctive use, essentially the management of these three reservoir systems. So the potential for groundwater storage. So we've talked a lot about groundwater, recharge, now recharge meaning storage. Wanted to highlight that the state of California, and this is a quote from the Natural Resources Secretary Wade Crowfoot, that and I won't articulate the entire quote, but really emphasizing the importance and the significance in the future of groundwater storage. What's illustrated with these bar charts is the potential, and that is the units, I apologize, are not illustrated there, but in the greater Sacramento Valley, that extends all the way up from the Sacramento region to Redding and even higher, there is the potential for up to 4 million plus acre feet of storage. And an acre foot is essentially an Olympic-sized swimming pool, or what an average family, 2 average households use in a given year. But there's the opportunity for more than 4 million acre feet of recharge, meaning that there's a lot of runoff potential in the Sacramento Valley that could be utilized. Now, that is a upper limit number. The infrastructure and the mechanisms are clearly not there today to make use of that storage. But again, it just gives an idea of the opportunity in our region and to the north of our region. So conjunctive use. The fundamentals of conjunctive use are quite simple. So again, it involves recharge and groundwater. During wet or average years, the conjunctive use is really essentially increasing the amount of surface water use and essentially utilizing less groundwater during those year types, those wet and average year types. And again, I mentioned that's really an in lieu recharge benefit for the most part, although there is direct injection and some other artificial recharge means that are being implemented in our region. But we get a recharge benefit by operating and emphasizing more use of surface water in wet and average years. Conversely, in dry years, we're looking to recover that groundwater and leave more surface water in our streams and creeks. There are multiple benefits in doing so, environmental benefits. There's benefits to potentially other users of that water. And so conjunctive use then again is trying to incentivize and manage water to essentially increase extractions of that water that we've recharged, and we'll get into banked during those wet and dry or wet and average years in those dry years. Next slide, please. So conjunctive use, I mentioned that we've been practicing a lot of conjunctive use in our region. On the left, these are the 2 subbasins in our greater Sacramento area. Of course, you can see Folsom Reservoir off to the east. The North American subbasin, bound by the Bear River on the northern edge of the basin boundary, essentially the foothills to the east, the Feather Sacramento on the west side, and the American River to the south. What's depicted here, these are water levels from one of our monitoring wells over time. I apologize, the x-axis of the chart is a little small or hard to read, but essentially that dates back from the 60s all the way to 2020, I believe. And you can see that groundwater levels declined for many decades. We were in overdraft conditions historically in our basin. With the implementation of conjunctive use by the member agencies that we represent, essentially bringing in surface water, conveyance pipelines, increasing the number of wells in the basin, we've been able to stabilize those groundwater levels. And actually they've increased over time. You can see a slight increase. Even during drought periods, we've seen very little change in water levels over that period. That's a great sign. It didn't come easy or by accident. Again, it came through these efforts of conjunctive use and water management. But again, when much of the state is seeing large groundwater level declines, we feel that we're in a pretty good shape and have managed the basin sustainably. Next slide. We also see this condition in the South American basin. Now, this monitoring well doesn't have as long a period of record, but you can see here that actually water levels have come up in this region slightly. These wells are generally indicative of wells in those areas of the basin. Many other areas of the basin, it's been fairly stable, and all of that. We have many hydrographs in our groundwater sustainability plans that you can kind of see the conditions elsewhere in the basin. But again, it shows that conjunctive use and also that our basin is fortunate that we receive good recharge as we have multiple surface water sources coming through our area. So we talked about conjunctive use being a method that has enabled us to maintain or even increase groundwater levels and come out of overdraft. That's our data. The data here you see on this slide to the left is actually from the state of California, Department of Water Resources. This is their popular, they used to be called dot maps, but these dots represent their wells that they've been monitoring either directly or through local agency data throughout the central portion of the Central Valley. We've kind of highlighted the Sacramento area here, again, where our groundwater basins reside. The yellow dots essentially mean that there's no significant trend that they've seen over a period from 1998 through 2018. And of course, this includes some major drought periods, including our current drought period. So in the areas where you see yellow dots, that's generally, frankly, a good sign that water levels have not declined kind of in those areas of the state. Certainly there's some orange dots and some red dots that shows between 2.5 or even greater feet of decline during that period, feet of groundwater level decline. And then green is obviously good, 2.5 or between 0 to 2.5 of an increase in water levels as depicted by these green dots. So the point here being, and when you zoom into kind of our region, you can see a lot of green dots. Not surprised, that supports our own data that we just showed you. But again, frankly, a great sign that we've been able to stabilize groundwater level declines that occurred historically, and that we have, frankly, a very healthy basin from a water level perspective. On the right, and this is a much more complicated map, frankly, there's just not a better one that I had access to. This is what's called a contour map, a groundwater level contour map, similar to, if you're familiar with surface contours, it depicts the level, the estimated level beneath our feet in terms of where you would encounter groundwater levels. Now, I mentioned on that hydrograph, and you saw the decline in water levels over that period before the 90s. That actually created areas that are called cones of depression. And those cones of depression are kind of depicted there, or you can see them in terms of those round spots there on that map. They indicate that actually we have storage space. The way to look at that is that there's actually opportunity to increase water levels there and use that space to store in groundwater, or essentially through in lieu practices. It's estimated that actually there's 1.8 million acre feet of available storage space in this area, in the greater Sacramento area. Just as a reminder, the city, or the Folsom Reservoir, when full, is just under 1 million acre feet of storage. So we're talking essentially 2 Folsom Reservoir size areas or storage space volumes beneath our feet in our groundwater basin. All right, so we're finally getting to what is a water bank, and thanks for bearing with me, but I wanted to make sure we kind of gave some foundational information on groundwater and conjunctive use. So at its core, what is a water bank? Water banks recharge and store water underground on behalf of specific parties. These can be local parties. These can also be parties outside of the basin. Water banks require formal accounting systems to keep track of balances. Now, again, the analogy to the financial system is used heavily, obviously, because there are so many similarities. So an accounting system is needed. It's one of the bigger challenges of creating a water bank. But essentially balances are drawn down during dry times as member agencies withdraw water, as we've kind of talked about, and balances increase during wet times as water is deposited through in lieu methods predominantly, but also direct artificial recharge methods. So that in a nutshell is a water bank. So how a bank works, how a water bank works. So the region here a few years back completed a regional water reliability plan, did some preliminary analysis of operating and expanding conjunctive use in our region. And what they found and documented was pretty interesting, and that's depicted here. So under wet conditions, the actual groundwater and surface water use is shown on the pie chart on the far left during the 2011 to 2013 years, the average use of each type, surface water and groundwater, during those 3 years, and those were wet years. And groundwater was used essentially 31% in terms of the total volume of water used in the region, and surface water, 69% of the total water used was surface water. There's the potential through expanding conjunctive use in creating a water bank to really increase the amount of surface water use, as shown by that pie just to the right, up to 86%, and then decrease groundwater use. And again, I mentioned that's kind of the fundamental of conjunctive use. That's what makes potentially, in lieu recharge happen, what makes it work. Under dry conditions, conversely, now we're looking at a dry year, and 2015, of course, was the drought year a few years back, that the actual groundwater use during that period was 36%, and surface water use was 64%. Frankly, not too much different than the actual wet conditions that you see on the far left. But under an expansion of conjunctive use, we're using the water bank, the analysis showed that we could really increase the amount of groundwater use, perhaps up to 58%, and decrease the amount to 42%. And again, that's utilizing then the bank, that's making that withdrawal after the water is stored during a wet condition. Next slide. So what does that mean in terms of volumes and infrastructure? So the study also pointed to, and these are estimates, but using existing systems, using the existing infrastructure that the region has, that during wet years, there's a recharge potential of maybe 63,000 acre feet and a recovery potential of 57,000, almost 58,000 acre feet in those dry years. What's shown on top of that is with infrastructure improvements, we could increase that. We can increase that perhaps up to 90,000 plus recharge potential in wet years, and maybe even higher, 94,000 acre feet in dry years. At that time, I believe it was estimated to be about 300 million in infrastructure needs. Don't quote me on that number. We're going through the water bank, we will be kind of looking at all this information and running more detailed analysis. But again, this is great news. We have the potential to really make some water available in the region utilizing this method. Next slide. So now this is the hardest slide. So now you've gotten the update on groundwater and conjunctive use. I went for it, and this one is going to take a little bit to work through, but it really gets to the potential benefits that we can receive in terms of utilizing the supply that can be made available. So we talked about conjunctive use, and again, that's shifting to more surface water and wet conditions and shifting to more groundwater and dry conditions, and those bar charts just kind of show that general relationship. Next slide, or next advance. Thank you. What does this result in? It results in healthier groundwater storage conditions, which in turn provides these benefits. Next. Thank you. Improved drought resiliency and opportunities for what are called groundwater substitution transfers, which the region has participated in, essentially making water available on the market. The benefits to our own region are the primary goal at this time with the water bank. We want to make sure that we have that drought resiliency, that water supply reliability. We need to make sure that we can maintain consistency and compliance with all regulatory and other standards. So banking really, again, advances this. And how banking works, again, it's conjunctive use, but here we're looking at actually making contributions to the bank. We actually kind of already have made contributions to the bank with a lot of infrastructure and planning, but banking that water and then recovering that water in future years. Again, looking at making sure that we always have healthy storage conditions in the basin. And then the benefits are some of the same and potentially even broader. Again, we talked about sustainability, enhanced sustainability or resiliency, reliability, the improved Central Valley project operational flexibility. Really, this also happens, and this is, again, where it gets much more detailed, but working with federal sponsors and Folsom Reservoir, how that's operated to really improve conjunctive use in the region. There are opportunity for ecosystem benefits, in-stream flow, temperature management, even environmental water. And again, opportunities to contribute to statewide water reliability is also a potential. And the opportunities within the bank include getting funding. If we can make water available, potentially there are partners, we can reinvest in infrastructure and then further expand conjunctive use. So it's the cycle up to a point that we can really essentially enhance our system with potential investments through this process. Water bank challenges. This is not going to be necessarily an easy process. There are a lot of obstacles. We have a great plan. And again, kind of laying things out by those stages that you saw. In order to incentivize using more groundwater or surface water for certain agencies, we need to look at making sure that the production, treatment, delivery, and the cost of disparity can be sorted out, that we can work through that. And again, we have experience doing that through different water accounting framework activities that we've done historically many years ago for water planning. Infrastructure expenses or expansion. Again, I mentioned that a little bit. There is a cost, obviously, to expanding this infrastructure in order to get further benefits. Institutional agreements, there are requirements in terms of making sure that we're consistent with water rights, place of use constraints. There could be operational challenges for agencies, even water quality concerns. Again, all of these are challenges. We believe we're aware of them. Really interested in your thoughts on challenges, things that we need to consider tonight. But those are the ones that kind of are foremost on our mind at this time. Thank you. All right, a few more slides. Applicable regulatory setting. There are many either regulatory or requirements, laws, as you can imagine, that we need to make sure that we are developing the bank under or in compliance with. Some of those are listed here. Let's start with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. This act was passed in 2015 and really sets forth a series of requirements for basins throughout the state to make sure that they're maintaining sustainable groundwater conditions. And what that means is they have to maintain sustainability or achieve sustainability over a 20-year period. Again, you saw water levels. There are other requirements to this. We do feel that we have a sustainable groundwater management or groundwater basin. Sustainability is defined by water levels, storage, water quality, our streams, and also what's called subsidence, making sure that the ground doesn't sink with overuse of groundwater. And again, we've put together a plan and addressed all of those requirements. And this bank would obviously be developed to making sure that we're consistent with those requirements and don't exceed them. CEQA and NEPA, CEQA is the requirements to, consider the environment and essentially complete a series of analysis to make sure discretionary actions by local agencies do not cause any significant impacts to the environment. And the federal requirement is NEPA. We will be completing CEQA and NEPA requirements as part of our implementation and plan to develop the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. The Water Forum Agreement. Water Forum Agreement was established more than 20 years ago, really to balance a series of interests in the greater Sacramento area. There's two co-equal objectives to really make sure that there's reliable water supply that meets the needs of businesses and the community in the region. And the other co-equal objective is to make sure that the lower American River essentially habitat and environment is maintained. So we will be working with the Water Forum Agreement when developing this bank and certainly be adhering to the requirements of the Water Forum Agreement. And then finally, the State Water Resources Control Board and reclamation policies. Again, the State Water Board controls water rights and reclamation. And I mentioned a federally recognized bank. There's guidelines to develop a bank as well as operate under Central Valley Project requirements, essentially the Bureau of Reclamation's requirements. And we are working with both of those entities. We'll be working with those entities in developing the bank. The reclamation policies for federally recognized banks really come down to a do no harm clause. There's more to it than that. Trust me, I don't quote me that that's it, but we're definitely making sure that we're going to be working under those policies and developing the bank. Next slide, please. And then finally, on that point, this illustrates or lists the acknowledged water banks, the acknowledged federally recognized water banks in California. The most of these banks are in the Tulare Lake, San Joaquin River hydrologic regions, and also I believe the Los Angeles or the South Coast region. These banks have some similarities in that they have conveyance, they have the surface water, obviously, they have the groundwater conditions, all of these fundamental to making banking work. Many of these banks, most of these banks do surface spreading. That's the recharge method. We're looking at this a little differently. We have in lieu as our primary recharge method, but we hope to obviously and plan to be added to this list ultimately as a federally recognized bank. And this is essentially the groundwater banking guidelines that Reclamation has on their website. You can see this information. And then finally, and Jim covered this in one of the answers as it relates to the South American basin. Jim pointed to the fact that our analysis right now and our work is really kind of focused on this urban core area of the basin, using sources of water supply, surface water supply that have been identified. There is always the opportunity after the bank is established to look at other sources of recharge to really expand the bank. But first things first, we're committed to the process that we have laid out. But we just wanted to mention this, that there's the potential of using agricultural supplies, what's called FloodMar, which is essentially a project that Department of Water Resources is implementing, looking at flood flows and other sources of water supply for recharge. Then this is my last slide, getting back to this roadmap. We've identified kind of the major activities here by stage outreach. This will continue throughout this process. We have our next planned stakeholder forum is going to be, and we haven't developed a date yet. And it really is kind of dependent, honestly, on how much outreach and engagement we get. But that is planned somewhere near the end of stage 1. We'll have more information to present at that time. Right now, we're working on the scoping and the description of the water bank, essentially what that entails in terms of the scope, the improving technical tools, modeling tools, so that we can analyze the effects of assumptions that we're thinking about with the bank. There's governance and institutional items that we need to work through in terms of the aforementioned accounting, developing alternatives ultimately, and then working on CEQA and NEPA compliance. I want to highlight again outreach. And as mentioned, really this is an opportunity with the Stakeholder Forum to try to bring everybody up to speed at specific times throughout the development of the bank, throughout these 3 stages. But our door is always open, as Jim mentioned, and any one of us you could reach out to at the Regional Water Authority. We'd be happy to discuss where we're at on the bank, hear from you directly on your thoughts regarding the bank. The bank is ultimately only going to be successful if we include your information, your understanding, and your considerations in water management. So we really do look forward to having a good dialogue with you, even outside the Stakeholder Forum. I think that's it.
Okay, well, thank you, Trevor. We're now going to get into our next questions, answers, and discussion segment. And by the way, your presentation really, people were really paying attention. So congratulations to all of you for asking a lot of great questions. So we are just going to start going through them, if that's okay.
Can you start the cameras for Ryan, Trevor, and I?
Yeah, Atlee, can you start the cameras up again for folks?
I'm going to be staring into the camera, looking at questions as they come up. So if I...
Okay. All right, so I'm just going to go through them in the order that they came into the Q&A panel. Dave Richardson had more of a comment. Having worked in the South American subbasin, I agree with Ocean Reserve that we are not aware of any recharge or injection wells in the SASB. Any response or any?
No, I mean, that's our understanding. Yeah, I know that entities are looking at it. And again, I don't want to misspeak in case there is something, but thanks for your comment, Dave.
George Murphy had a few questions. We hear all the time about the amount of building occurring within the Sacramento region and the continued need for conservation. Will RWA or any of the various GSAs inform water purveyors, agencies, as to whether water will be available for development projects?
So I'll take that one real quick, but I'd also invite Trevor to join in on this answer. And that is there needs to be some coordination with the groundwater sustainability agencies and planning departments regarding water supply availability.
Yeah, development, great question. And I'm reading it again, I apologize. And fresh on our minds, frankly, is working on the groundwater sustainability plan to meet the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requirements, because we're required to look at existing and planned land use and get an understanding of the potential demands 20 years out from now, so that we can make sure that we're adequately managing to potential future demands. And so we did that. We definitely included the known development in that sustainability plan. And based on our projections in our North American subbasin, I worked specifically on the North American subbasin, we're essentially balanced 20 years out. So we're hoping that those water level projections remain stable. And the benefit of the bank is that that can help and will help with maintaining sustainability. Because again, we're interested in making sure that we have water supply reliability in our own region.
Thank you, Trevor. Next question came from Ocean Reserve. What do you mean by our subbasin? And how does that relate to subbasins identified by DWR Bulletin 118 and the requirements of Sigma?
Yeah, thanks. You know, and apologize, it wasn't maybe specific at points. Our subbasin, I think I've been working on the North American subbasin too closely. It feels like my subbasin at times, but it is a Bulletin 118 subbasin. So the North American subbasin is defined under DWR Bulletin 118, as is the South American subbasin. Those are two of the subbasins identified in that document.
Muriel Strand asked, what is the zero level for the groundwater graph?
Yeah, I think that's means sea level. So those graphs, I believe, were referenced to mean sea level. Great question, Muriel. We should always have that reference point on those graphs. So we'll look at that and make sure that that's true when we go back. It looks like we might be going back now, but I believe that's reference to mean sea level. Yep. One more back. That one might be feet below ground surface. I apologize. The one that's feet below ground surface. The one before that, you go back one more. That's mean sea level. So Muriel, thanks. My science teacher would be after me right now if I was still in school to have two different references on charts, but I will clean that up. What's important is the trend remains the same, but thank you for pointing that out, and I'll make that improvement in future presentations.
And we're glad that you all are really paying attention. That's great.
Yeah.
There are several questions from Barbara Evoy. Do you want to go through all of them at once?
Sure.
Okay. The first one is, as in-lieu usage entails using surface water in wet and average years, what scientific analysis will be undertaken to ensure there is no impact to environmental resources in these times? Will the public review, what will be the public review of this work?
I'll take a crack at that. I think that's it's an important question, and in addition to the modeling tools that we have right now, that will be able to be helpful to identify if we're having impacts on groundwater dependent ecosystems or other things like that. So that is part of the, I would say analysis, scientific analysis, I think is maybe a little bit limiting in its definition. Analysis, which includes scientific and engineering methods. The next question is how will this work? How will this work and these diversions be coordinated with the Sacramento Water Forum agreement? So as Ms. Evoy knows, there is an existing Sacramento Water Forum agreement and maybe a potential future water forum agreement, which is being considered, and we're in the early phases of that. I think that it would be important that we acknowledge that those are a series of constraints that are placed on water diversions right now in the Lower American River. Although I think that some people probably need to discuss what that means and how those effects will be carried out in the future. If I can just sort of scroll through, and I think I'd like to answer a couple more questions that Ms. Evoy has put on the chat.
Absolutely.
As SGA and SCGA have not allocated water by user / purveyor, how does RWA see the allocation water bank system working? I think we're really early in the process of that question, and we don't really have an answer for that just yet. I think there's a little bit more things that we need to think about and also hear from the community regarding these types of things. How does RWA see authorities of SCGA and SGA in the overlap of extractions with RWA in a water bank? Who has authority over pumpers? I'm going to try my best at that one, but I'm going to ask for Trevor to fill in if he has additional insight. But I'm going to say that the GSAs have authorities over pumpers. And the GSAs are going to be very important in the regulatory setting of the water bank. And Trevor, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that?
The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act did give authority to groundwater sustainability agencies to limit pumping and some other authorities. The counties obviously always have authority over groundwater pumpers as well. In many cases, the counties are part of the GSAs in our region. So you're right, there is a certain amount of authority that was provided in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
Thank you. And then lastly, Ms. Evoice has asked the question, when you talk about a federal water bank, can you please describe the benefits, but also the limitations of using that structure? Can the water bank be both a federal water bank and an other type of water bank? So when we talk about it's actually a federally recognized groundwater bank. This is an authority provided for in a law passed 30 years ago. It was a federal statute, the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. And there are certain things that you would need to do to get a federally recognized groundwater bank. The benefit of a federally recognized groundwater bank is you could potentially store reclamation contract water in a water bank. To the question, what are the benefits and also the limitations? I think we're trying to understand that right now. I think we have a good sense of what the benefits and limitations might be. I will add that I think a federally recognized groundwater bank, I wouldn't characterize it as a structure as much as a set of rules that you'd have to operate by to ensure sustainability and protection of other users of water. Can the water bank be both a federal and other type of water bank? I suppose the answer to that question is yes. Many people like to think that we actually have a water bank right now. We don't have a federally recognized water bank. We don't have an analysis so far, which an environmental analysis, which really covers or investigates impacts. But if in the very loosest sense, if people or agencies are conducting conjunctive use and they're allowing water to go into the ground or bank water into the ground, in the very loosest sense of the term, Ms. Evoy, yes, that is a bank. I think that we want to have more structure around this one in the future. I think it's really important to also identify that we are really thinking about how to protect all uses of water in the future, including groundwater dependent ecosystems, shallow domestic well owners, and the like. And we also want to build in and incorporate rules that already exist in terms of water banking and the like that exist on the books for groundwater transfers and such. Thank you very much.
Barbara actually had two more questions in the chat. I can read them off to you if you'd like.
Please.
Okay. As a co-equal objective of the Water Forum, how does the water bank proposal support the environmental health of the Lower American River? Several groups have talked about the need to have a water bank put aside for environmental needs. How is this envisioned?
I think we're in the early phase of really understanding what that looks like right now. I think that there needs to be some analysis to identify how that would work. One thing that we've talked about in the past for a water bank is a leaving a little water in the groundwater basin with various operations from the groundwater bank. I think that might be beneficial to the environment in the future, but I think that there's a lot more analysis that we need to do. I want to just sort of offer a really high level perspective also, and that is the water bank is a mechanism to encourage conjunctive use. And conjunctive use, the hallmark of that is to be able to utilize more surface water for water users when surface water is plentiful, and more groundwater when surface water is not plentiful. If we do this right, I think that will be beneficial to the environment, including the Lower American River, which I think all of us are very concerned about. So that is a key element of conjunctive use and water banking. Thank you.
Jim, and there's one more question from Barbara. As many of these water transfers / sales involve significant amounts of money, how are you planning to engage your public stakeholders on the use of the proceeds? Do you see the proceeds as being able to address some of the environmental justice and/or disadvantaged community needs?
So that's a question that I think is not something that I can answer myself. This is a question that I think that the transferors of water might be thinking about and stuff like that, but I have no authority to commit the water agencies under this situation. I have no authority or ability to do that. So, Barbara, I'm not going to be able to really answer that question. Again, RWA is not a transfer. Thank you.
Trevor, you look like you wanted to add something?
No, I mean, just getting back to maybe to Barbara's, one of the first questions she had, and Jim covered this, but yeah, we do have modeling tools that we're improving. We mentioned that in terms of the stage slide. And so those tools specifically, and we will be presenting the results of that analysis to stakeholders, getting their feedback, making sure that they really understand those tools and how we're using them as part of that process.
And I just want to have one last opportunity to round out what I said. And that is, well, the RWA is not in a position to, really address this question. Sometime in the future, a discussion of transfers will occur, and that will be a discussion point. So we're not closing the book on this.
When Pratt had a question, how do you categorize increased use of surface water as groundwater recharge? Isn't it really just not using as much groundwater?
Where is this question? Let me see. Can you say it again? Sorry.
Sure. How do you categorize increased use of surface water as groundwater recharge? Isn't it really just not using as much groundwater?
No, I mean, in-loop recharge is a recognized recharge, artificial means of recharging the basin. So it's a form of, again, the way we're implementing conjunctive use, and we do make water available then, as we're essentially storing that water underground that would be regularly using.
I'd like to also add to Trevor's answer. Thank you, Trevor. Great answer. But I just want to give a hypothetical example. So imagine there is an area that has historically used a lot of groundwater within the Sacramento region. One of the opportunities to do better conjunctive use would be providing surface water to that historically dependent groundwater area. And that could be through the form of infrastructure in the future. That would allow potential to have that area stop using its groundwater wells, stop pumping groundwater, and allow more groundwater to increase within the basin. But that would happen at a time when there is surface water available, maybe plenty of surface water available, that it wouldn't be harmful to a river or some other purpose. And in that case, it's actually displacing groundwater use in that area with surface water. So the answer to that question, Ms. Pratt, is in some ways, yes, it's not using groundwater in that area, but it's substituting it for with some other source. Thank you for that question.
And I want to add that, I had that slide that had a series of bar charts in the Sacramento Valley, and then also depicted in the San Joaquin Valley, more than 4 million acre feet of water available. There's a lot of surface water that just simply isn't captured, that is lost as flood flows. And Ryan conveyed this also on that one image of California. So we're really trying to optimize that surface water so it's not lost, and instead of using our groundwater system. So that's where water essentially is made available and how the recharge occurs. So it's, we did not present a lot of slides on how much surface water in our specific region, because we're still working through tools to give a more accurate answer that is essentially available to us to recharge. I think in a future meeting, we'll be able to kind of illustrate that relationship with some actual more enhanced data from our region, and we'll be able to kind of go there again, and hopefully you'll bring that question up again during that time.
Thank you. Dave Richardson had a question for you, Trevor. The trends on the groundwater map are in feet per year, correct? So quite a few feet over the 20-year period. We have seen substantial declines in groundwater levels in the harvest water area in the past that our project intends to reverse. Trends downward in the Cosumnes Basin, just south of the river, as well as documented in their GSP.
Yeah, thanks for the comment, Dave. I appreciate you kind of mentioning some of the other projects in the South American and Cosumnes area.
Lynn Wheat had two questions. The first is, have the banking partners been identified? And then the second is, what part does the Harvest Water Project play in this conjunctive use plan?
So I'd like to take those. So far, we have identified certain banking partners, and those are primarily the urban water agencies, or a number of them in the Sacramento region. I'm having a hard time recollecting them right off the top, but I think that they are also members. They are certainly members of the Regional Water Authority. City of Sacramento, County of Sacramento, Placer County Water Agency, San Juan Water District are example agencies that are participating. That's not all of them, but there are, those are for example. But I also want to address the question, what part does Harvest Water Project play in this conjunctive use plan? I'm going to say that the Harvest Water Project is really an important project for our region. And I also want to commend the Regional Sanitation District for the work that they're doing on that. I think that there's more discussions that we need to have with Regional San to see how that fits into the water bank. Those discussions have occurred over time, but I don't think that they've come to a point where we're ready to definitively answer that question. But before I depart from it also, as I think Dave Richardson knows, who has been involved in that project, again, they are employing a conjunctive use method to address declines in groundwater levels in that part of Sacramento County. And it's also very helpful for the groundwater sustainability plans within the region, because it is an important project that addresses groundwater and provides benefits to groundwater users and to the groundwater plans and to the GSAs. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Vanessa, while I'm at it, I see a question from Clyde McDonald. I'm going to read that one off too. You are proposing to divert more water out of the American River in wet periods. How will you determine when these diversions will not harm the American River and the American River Parkway? That's a great question. And I think that's a really important question. It's a North Star question for this effort. And what I want to say to that is we're starting to look at that. We are early in the analysis, but we've looked at the opportunity for potential flood periods to take water off the river. I think that we've looked a little bit more broadly at that. I do think that more analysis needs to happen to make sure that we're not harming the lower American River. But one of the things I think is really important to get out there is again, if we do this right, this will be a net positive for the lower American River in terms of a conjunctive use mechanism that utilizes surface water when it's plentiful and uses groundwater when surface water is not plentiful, and that we are banking water in a way that is really healthy for other users, including groundwater dependent ecosystems. And then I'm going to invite Trevor if he wants to add anything to that question, to that answer.
No, I think that's well stated. And again, you know, we're again, I keep mentioning we're enhancing these tools to look at this and run a lot of scenarios and analysis. And so it's going to be a very detailed process, and we're looking forward to when we get there to really get input and present that material to the stakeholders.
Yeah, and then lastly, I do think that this is an important question to carry over into the future. So we're going to have more discussions about this question in the future.
Fantastic. Jay Boatwright has a few questions in the chat, and I'll just group those together. And I think they're probably addressed to you, Trevor, because they probably need to be answered by a hydrogeologist. Geologically, can groundwater basins that have been lowered by drawdown receive recharge water at the same capacity as was naturally there?
Yeah, good question. The drawdown, as I showed on that contour map, really enables a lot more storage potential than if our basin was absolutely full and water levels were just beneath our feet. Then we wouldn't be here talking about this opportunity. So we have a tremendous opportunity in our basin. Other water banks throughout the state, they also have conditions where there is essentially a storage area that's been created by groundwater withdrawal. So yeah, we're well positioned to receive a recharge and be able to store it naturally in our basin.
And there was another question from Jay. What are the criteria where we have contributed to the groundwater bank and then not been able to use that water?
Can you say that again, please?
What is the criteria where we have contributed to the groundwater bank and then not been able to use that water?
I think that's probably referring to leave behind, right? It would be how I would interpret that question. And
yeah, I mean, it brings up, potentially not knowing exactly, your interest here 100%, Jay, but the bank and how it will be operated is kind of at the heart of your question, and essentially what water potentially remains in the bank. All of this has yet to be kind of decided and worked through. I mentioned that the bank is a concept where we're really making deposits and then withdrawals. And again, many of our agencies have been doing that for years. And again, that's been seen in those hydrographs. But specifically, the operation criteria that we use, that has yet to be really discussed and decided. And so that will be part of the discussion and part of the process later in this stage and next. So look forward to having more of a discussion on that topic.
And Jay had another follow-up question that he just posted. Is there a chance that we put water into the basin, but then we'll not be able to withdraw that water?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it gets to the hydraulics of how water moves out of our basin. And again, by having a cone of depression, it's really like dropping a water in a bowl. That water moves, hydraulically down to that lowest spot in the bowl and not out of the bowl. And so those cones of depression, again, enable us to bank a lot of the water that's recharged. There is water that flows underneath our basin, as subsurface flow to other subbasins, and from those other subbasins potentially into our basin. That's a science that's hard to understand exactly without doing a lot of modeling and water budgeting. And so there is always the potential that you make deposits in the basin in certain areas, and then that water, if it's stored for many years, may physically move outside of your control. But we're going to look at the science there too. We're not too concerned about that. We're not necessarily looking for getting that exact molecule of water. Of course, we're talking in lieu, but when we do direct recharge, that exact molecule back out, just like going into the bank, you're not getting necessarily the same dollar that you deposited back out. So as long as volumetrically we can store the water and recover it, we're going to be in good shape.
There's several questions from Ted Rao. I was going to group those together.
Let's group those together, please.
Okay. The first one is, will the bank begin with zero balances for participants? If not, how will any carryover balances be established, and how do they relate to GSPs, since they may not have been considered when sustainability was determined?
Yeah, I'm gonna start with that one. And Mr. Rao, we don't know the answer to that question yet. I know that this is something that is on the environmental community's mind, and but this one is one where we're going to have to sort through and analyze it. and make sure that we're doing it in a way that is still sustainable and protective. But we do not have an answer for that right now. I know that we've been in a dialogue about these types of things and what is the appropriate baseline to start. And I think that, again, we're not ready to answer that question. We still have more analysis to do, and there still needs to be some more dialogue around this question. But thank you for asking the question.
The next question was, your climate change presentation demonstrated a large amount of surface water that went uncaptured in 2017. Why are you not working with Safeco to take advantage of this supply option?
I really appreciate this question. I would say that we are starting to work with Safeco to try to sort through these types of things. There was a great deal of uncaptured water in 2017. I think we want to think about those ways that we can capture that in the future that is appropriate. I think that some of the ideas that are out there right now in terms of flood mars and such still have some unanswered questions. There's a lot of work that we need to do with Safeco in order to be able to, and I know that Safeco is working hard on this, but I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to be able to bring that to fruition. And Mr. Rao, I think you are indeed referring to flood mar. Maybe it's something else. We all also working on opportunities to take water off the system through ASR, although that only provides a very modest flood benefit. But that is part of the portfolio too. Thank you for the question.
And then there's one last question from Ted. The Water Forum has completed a gap analysis that projects climate change water supply impacts out to 2070. Are you going to consider this analysis in your estimates of water availability? And should you be giving more consideration to excess stormwater as banking supply?
So I'm going to spend a minute to read that question. And I'm going to repeat it. Thank you, Vanessa. The Water Forum has completed a gap analysis that projects climate change water supply impacts out to 2070. Are you going to consider this analysis in your estimates of water availability? And should you be giving more consideration to excess storm water as a banking supply? And I think the answer to that is we probably should be. Climate change impacts are going to be very serious, and they're going to be very hard on the region and hard on the state of California. And I think that we need to be considering every option available for banking water. So I think that is right.
Next questions came in from Robert Burness, and he has a few, so I can group those together as well. His first is, how do we ensure a balance between the opportunity for water banking agencies to profit on the banked groundwater storage sales to other entities and realize the environmental benefits in our region?
I think this is a question similar to water transfers and the like. And again, the RWA cannot commit its members right now on any of those types of things. I think that this is a discussion that we're going to defer for the future.
His next question is, how does regional sands inland recharge with treated wastewater relate to the regional water bank, if at all?
I think I answered hopefully, Mr. Burness, the answer that I provided a little bit earlier helped to address that question. I know that's the part of the Harvest Water Project. I'm not exactly sure if there was a different dimension that one of my colleagues might want to add on. Okay. I'm seeing them shake their heads in the room. Okay. No.
There's one last question that he just added, probably as a follow-up. You've heard several questions about water banking sustainability in an era of climate change impacts, and have recognized the need to work through these problems. How do we effectively engage with RWA in the implementation of the water bank beyond Q&A sessions?
I'm glad Mr. Burness is asking this question, because I think one of the things I'm really interested in doing is having a discussion with the environmental NGO members. We are interested in having that. And at some point, there is going to be some engagement with the environmental caucus to sort through these. I know that the environmental caucus of the Water Forum is very interested in having these dialogues. Yet to come. We will be doing that.
Suzanne Pesci has a few questions. What is the relationship of the amount of recaptured sewer water from urban water users and rural groundwater users available for treatment and amount of surface water available for conjunctive use?
That I don't know. It's, I really don't know the numbers on that. We'd have to kind of look at that in maybe Susan offline, see if we can get at that question. It's a good question, very technical though, and I just don't have that at my fingertips.
Your next question is the South American Subbasin GSP, as I remember, was based on 2015 Sac County General Plan. How is the new development data being presented in the annual DWR updates? And how is the information being made available for public review as new projects are added to the SASB?
So we have representatives here tonight for the RWA and the Sacramento Groundwater Authority, but not the Sacramento Central Groundwater Authority. I'm hesitant to answer this question because I feel like it's not within our jurisdiction, but maybe most appropriate for the folks at the Sacramento Central Groundwater Authority. And Ms. Pesci, I really apologize for punting on this one, but I feel like we might be, it's probably not appropriate for us to weigh in on that particular question.
We'll kind of put that in the parking lot.
It's a good parking lot question. Yes.
And our last question is finally, do all participants in a water bank have access to review the quote unquote bank checkbook? Does the public have access to review the checkbook or potential overdrafts by depositors and transfers? I make this comment relative to a lawsuit by the current fan lawsuit.
This is a really good question. This is a question about transparency. And I do think that I don't have an answer to this question, and I don't mean to just sort of put it in the parking lot, but I think this is an informative question in terms of what's on the members' minds in the community. And I do think that a mechanism to be able to provide a level of transparency to the community is really important. So I think this is something we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, but I'll also mention that, there is definitely transparency, obviously, through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and our groundwater levels. And we've established minimum thresholds for water levels throughout the basin, as all basins subject to the sustainability regulations need to do. And so you'll very much be able to kind of see the health of the basin just by looking at the information that is provided. Water levels are provided semi-annually in the annual reports. There's a description in terms of how the basin is being managed in relation to these water level thresholds. And those thresholds were specifically developed to make sure they consider beneficial uses and users of all water in a very public process. And so, there's going to be multiple forms of transparency. And I mentioned, other regulatory programs that we're required to adhere to. So, it'll be very public, and is now, exactly how the basin is being managed and where water levels are at and what might constitute perhaps unsustainable conditions. And I could speak to that at length with you, and would love to, kind of articulate and explore that information with you if you're further interested, and point you to all of that information.
Thank you. It's a question from Gwen Pratt. Is the establishment of the water bank considered to be a project as defined by CEQA?
Yes. So the folks in the room are pointing my attention to a statement. Yes, the RWA is making a discretionary decision to implement a project. And the answer to that question is yes. We're a ways away from beginning the CEQA process, though. So a little bit more work needs to be done before we define the project.
Thank you. Dave Richardson had a question. I appreciate your overview of future potential recharge sources and regions outside of the urban areas. Will you be doing outreach specifically in the rural and agricultural areas? It sounds like it from your presentation.
Yes, and Dave, I'm not sure if you're referencing kind of one of the last slides in my portion of the presentation, looking at potential opportunities kind of outside what we consider kind of the urban core of where where this effort is being focused now. But we will definitely, be reaching out to rural and agricultural areas, not only in this process, so they kind of have an understanding of what's happening in the basin, but certainly if we ever expanded, that would be at the heart of the stakeholder effort.
And Lynn Wheat has a few questions. Question about growth in our region. The city of Elk Grove has it in their present general plan, model homes could be built without an identified source of water if approved by mayor and city council. This is very concerning to me. More of a comment.
Yeah, thanks for your comment, Lynn.
Yeah, can I take a crack at that? I'm not aware of that particular requirement for the city of Elk Grove. I don't think it's beyond the scope of this discussion and the water bank to get into a conversation about the city of Elk Grove's general plan, and that water could, says model homes. I'm just going to say homes. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Ms. Wheat, but homes could be built without an identified source of water if approved by the mayor and council. I'm not aware of that requirement, but my understanding is there's limitations under the Urban Water Management Planning Act on being able to approve homes and other sources without a source of water. I don't want to say that this is a definitive answer to that question, but I do think that there might be more and a better answer to this question. We're not able to provide it tonight.
Thank you. There's a question from Chris Little, or actually just a comment. And thank you for this one. Thanks for a great presentation. It's been really informative. It's also very encouraging to have such a concerted, well-organized effort to protect our water supply in the face of climate change. Okay. There was a comment by Paul Helliker that he wanted to make sure that attendees know that securing federal recognition of a water bank is necessary to be able to bank CVP water outside of the boundaries of a CVP contractor. The water bank already exists for in lieu and injection, well recharge and recovery of CVP water within agency boundaries, as well as water right water. They should also know that the bank has more than 385,000 acre feet of water in it, and it is used regularly for water supply and transfers to other users. Then if you want to comment on Paul's statement.
I don't think we want to comment on Paul's statement.
Okay. Luke Citron had a question. Is it possible to anticipate drought years? How will the water bank and conjunctive use work through droughts that last longer than anticipated?
I'm going to invite my colleague Ryan Ojakian to also weigh in on this, but what I want to say is it's really difficult to anticipate future drought years, but we do know that they're going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. We don't know when the drought years are going to come, but the climate analysis tells us that they are going to come and that they're going to be more severe. What the water bank and conjunctive use does is allow us to capture more water in the other thing that's going to happen as part of climate change, which is more extreme wet periods, so that we are then in a better position to weather those drought years whenever they do come. So we couldn't look out in the future and say 2028 is going to be a drought year. In fact, our predictive capacity is much, much shorter than that. We're talking a few weeks, but we can say with a great deal of confidence that there will be more severe droughts coming in the future, as well as those more severe extreme wet conditions. And that the water bank and conjunctive use is an adaptation strategy to those extremes.
Right. Thomas Mahal had a question. What are the threats to groundwater quality during heavy recharge/wet seasons when wells are drawing low volumes?
Interesting question. I don't think there's any kind of systemic groundwater quality concern during heavy recharging, wet seasons. As you point out, with implementation of conjunctive use, wells are drawing less volume during those periods. We have part of and we've been doing groundwater management predating the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act for more than 20 years before that. We have a really good sense of the water quality concerns in the North American subbasin, whether it's metals and minerals, as well as potential other threats to groundwater. So we feel confident that we have data to understand areas of the basin where there may be some water quality impacts that we need to avoid. But I don't see any major issue during those periods.
Thank you. There are two questions from Ocean Reserve. How will undesirable results as defined by SGMA, for example, impacts on residential wells and groundwater dependent ecosystems, be avoided if the RWA bank operates independently from the relevant GSPs for the two subbasins?
I'll take that one. It's not going to operate independently from the two GSAs. And I think that's important, an important thing to identify. Mr. Joseph said earlier that the water bank fits in a regulatory framework. There was a slide on that, and groundwater sustainability agencies and their GSPs are an important part of that. So they are not detached. Thank you for the question, OSHA. And what is OSHA's next question?
How does RWA propose that the stated priority of meeting regional water supply needs first be implemented? Won't bank supplies more likely be sold to the highest bidder outside the region on the transfer market as in past years?
I want to acknowledge that one of the things that could happen within the region for conjunctive use is that there could be water transfers in the future. And I think a number of agencies within the region are very interested in doing that. I think that they need to be done in a very sustainable way. And one of the aims of the water bank is to make sure that that is happening. I also want to say that it's very important to meet local needs first, that there is a water supply for our community before any of that stuff happens, that we are addressing what needs to be addressed in groundwater sustainability plans. So thank you for the question, OSHA.
And I want to add that groundwater levels again have been stable, as you've seen in some of the hydrographs, and transfers have occurred in this basin, and this basin has shown that those have been done very sustainably. We have not done any groundwater substitution transfers that have resulted in groundwater level declines that haven't rebounded very quickly as part of recharge. Our basin's been very resilient and responsive to groundwater substitution transfers. So, we have been doing it. We have not seen impacts. Certainly something we're going to monitor for. But if the agencies decide to continue to do those transfers, we have a record of success and kind of a proof of concept that again, it can be done very sustainably in our basin.
And just to add one other element to this, the long-term trends within the Sacramento region have been trending up. This is not RWA's evidence, but the State Department of Water Resources evidence, as shown in Bulletin 118. And even over a course of 20 years, a course of a mega drought, and with water transfers that have occurred within the region, water levels are increasing in this region. That goes to show the benefits of conjunctive use.
Okay. Muriel Strand has a few questions. And what starts out what looks like a comment. Taking the banking concept to the idea of getting interest on that investment of water storage, the ROI depends on how effectively we use what we actually use, whether surface or groundwater, depending on the year. And she also had a question. What role do LAFCOs play in all of this?
So I'll take the LAFCO question. I don't believe that LAFCOs have any part in the regulation of the groundwater bank. And LAFCOs don't really have any oversight of this initiative.
Okay. Robert Burness had another question. It's important to recognize that the formalization of RWA's water bank among its members will set the framework for water banking beyond the north and central groundwater basins. The stakes are very important. Stakeholder and public engagement is critical.
I agree with that, Mr. Burness. I think it is important, and I agree that this might be a trend-setting situation, if I can characterize it that way. Again, we're very interested in this, and one of the things I wanted to take the opportunity to discuss is, Mr. Burness, you were part of the environmental caucus of the Water Forum, and I know that Mr. Rao earlier in the evening asked a question about baseline. And I think that we want to address that and other questions in future stakeholder forums. But I want to underscore that the RWA has an open door policy, which means please call us if you have questions or concerns and talk to us about it. You can call Mr. Ojakian, Mr. Joseph, or myself. And then lastly, we will be increasing our engagement with the Environmental Caucus in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all of your wonderful responses. And thank you to all of you who joined us tonight, because we realize this is in the evening and taking time away from your day. And there are more questions that are entered into the Q&A panel. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to those within our 2-hour time frame tonight. So I would like to be mindful of your time and move us along to the end of the presentation.
This is my part. I want to thank you all for participating in the Stakeholder Forum tonight. There will be more stakeholder forums. I think that we got a lot of good feedback tonight, a lot of good questions. We got a lot of good questions before this meeting, which helped to inform the slides that we presented tonight. We will be talking again. And again, thank you very much. And this concludes the Stakeholder Forum tonight.